Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Seds 101, what you need to know right now about the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. I'm Brett Swots, an Associate Director at the NATO Research Foundation and head up our Stronger Seds, Stronger Regions program funded by the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Really grateful you've joined us for today's session. With so many new staff being hired on at districts and tribes in the wake of the pandemic, we thought the timing was right to deliver another Seds fundamentals session. I know many of you on the call today are new to the Seds, though we do have a few veterans looking to hear the latest trends and best practices. But no matter where you fall on that spectrum, we hope you find today's training valuable and supportive of your work. So today's webinar is the first in a 2-month webinar series the NATO Research Foundation is hosting on Seds, recovery, and resilience. As a background, the NATO Research Foundation is the nonprofit research and training affiliate of the National Association of Development Organizations. NATO is a membership association of regional development organizations and economic development districts all across the country, but primarily those that are serving smaller metropolitan and rural regions. Now we're in the 5th year of our Stronger Seds, Stronger Regions program, which is generously funded through a grant from EDA. Through this program, we've organized trainings and conferences, led webinars, created case studies and videos, and developed other resources to train regional staff on all things related to the Seds process and document. So in a bit, I'll share a little bit more about how to access all the free materials we've developed through this program that you can explore at your own pace. So once again, thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar. Here's a few quick kind of housekeeping items. You can type in your questions or comments via the questions box that you should see on the drop-down menu on the right side of your screen. All of us will try to get to as many of these questions as we can towards the end of our presentation, but feel free to type them in as they come to you. The question we hear most often, of course, will this webinar be recorded? And absolutely. So a recording of the webinar as well as the slides that you see today should be available later today or first thing in the morning tomorrow at our website, nato.org, as well as sedscentral.com. Also want to give you a heads up on the next webinar in our series, which will be on March 23rd, focused on rural resilience and economic development. We'll be joined by Don Mackey of E2 Entrepreneurial Ecosystems for a conversation about mega trends in rural development, best practices to supporting small towns and rural places, entrepreneurship, community development frameworks, and a whole lot more. So we hope you can join us on March 23rd for that conversation with Don. And of course, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions about the work we do with the NATO Research Foundation, or more specifically about our Stronger Seds, Stronger Regions program. Love to hear from you. I'd love to hear kind of what you're working on and how we can support your efforts. So today I'm joined by a great group of speakers, including David Ives, the planning coordinator at EDA, and Meilani Shivens, the owner and director of Rainco's Data. Now, Dave and I will tag team a presentation to put the Seds in context, explain why it matters, describe best practices, and share how it fits into EDA's overall vision for economic development and recovery. And then Meilani will share her experiences on working on the Southeast Conference Seds in Alaska and lessons learned and tips for putting together an engaging and influential Seds. So all three of us on this call today are really passionate about the Seds and really believe in the value of the process. And we hope at the end of this webinar, you'll feel the same way. So with that, let's dive into our presentations here too. Dave, just want to do an audio check to make sure you're still with me, and then I'll kick things off.
Can you hear me?
Perfect, great, thanks, Dave.
Fantastic.
So let me just jump in here, quickly. For those of you who are new to the Seds, just kind of a quick rundown. At its core, it's a locally based, regionally driven economic development planning process and document that really creates the space for your region to identify its strengths and weaknesses and bring together a diverse set of partners to create good jobs, diversify the economy, and spur economic growth. So consider it a guide or a roadmap that your region creates and follows towards regional prosperity and resilience. An important thing to remember is that the Seds belongs to your region. Yes, it is a requirement for EDA, but ultimately the Seds, like the future of your region, is in the hands of local stakeholders and residents like yourself. So I want to turn it over to Dave to kind of flesh that out a little bit more and kind of give you the perspective from EDA about the value of the Seds and why this is such an important document, but also the process going into it. So take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Brett. Really appreciate that. Great to be here with you all this afternoon. It's important to start by saying how much of a a strong proponent EDA is of the concept, and many folks have heard me say this before, but that good economic development starts with good economic development planning. And if you think about the role of the public sector in economic development, and that includes all of you, it's this idea of capacity building, of helping communities and regions, either build, improve, or better leverage their assets so that the businesses in their communities and regions can succeed. And the Seds is really how you plan to build that capacity for economic development. If you're going to be successful in engaging in economic development, you need to be successful in the planning. And that's really where the Seds comes in. So it's very much foundational to the nature of planning to EDA, and it can be seen in the technical stuff that you see there on the slide. The requirements for designation of an EDD or accessing EDA implementation grants, whether they're public works or economic adjustment assistance, they all have a strong tie to the Seds. So again, very foundational to what we do. Next slide. And it's not just EDA that sees the value of comprehensive regional planning. Other organizations, including other federal agencies, are acknowledging the importance of planning as a precursor to funding implementation projects. So a great example of that, a good case in point, is USDA's Strategic Economic and Community Development Program, also known as SECD program, which is focused on certain rural development programs and emphasizes the collaboration and coordination among multiple stakeholders that we all we all get behind as part of the Seds. But this particular SECD program requires that up to 15% of certain programs funded through rural development need to show linkages to a regional strategic plan. And many have been and will continue to use the Seds as that plan. So it's a great example of how the Seds is moving beyond just EDA funding and it really becoming a great tool and a fantastic mechanism to access other sources of funding, whether they be other federal sources or other state and regional sources.
Great. Yeah, so I like to say that we're really fortunate to be working on the Seds, at this particular point in time, when EDA has really empowered districts and regions to make the Seds process and document more inclusive, more engaging, and really more interesting than it ever has been before. And that really goes back to the release of the Seds content guidelines back in 2015, when we've entered what I like to call the golden age for the Seds. We're seeing some really transformative efforts underway, both in the planning and implementation of the Seds. So Dave, just wanted to have you kind of give a little bit of background about the content guidelines and some of those key required sections of the Seds. We're not going to dive too deep into each of these, but to at least know that there's these resources available to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. The Seds content guidelines is really a foundational document when it comes to developing and updating the Seds. It's been around for about 5 years now, actually probably closer to 6. But at the time it was developed, there really wasn't a lot out there intended to help districts and other planning entities put together a Seds. I mean, we had a few, one-pagers that really didn't do much, but kind of rehash what was already in the regulation. So we really wanted to create something that was going to be useful, that's going to be a tool. And that's really what the Seds content guidelines are. They're a tool. And, it's a list of suggestions, it's a list of recommendations. What it's not is a new set of additional requirements. What we recommend in the Seds content guidelines are just that, they're recommendations. But we hope that you will want to pursue a lot of the information that's within the Seds content guidelines, because we feel it really does help in crafting stronger Seds. So the guidelines offer suggestions on what should be included in each of the required sections, and those are kind of outlined very briefly in the regs. And it recommends tools and resources and examples to help in the development of the Seds. So there are these sections within the Seds content guidelines that we call recommended resources that really will point you in different directions when you're working on that particular portion of the Seds. And it really, I think, had two kind of key elements to the Seds content guidelines. The first is we made a couple of formatting recommendations, basically focused on the look and feel. The first was, when you're putting your Seds together, to think about keeping your audience in mind. So do things that are going to target the page length, things like executive summaries and appendices. Things are going to let you keep the document short and tight and focused and really help you tell a specific story. And the other thing that we really try to advocate for is this concept of being creative and communicating creatively through the Seds. And that comes in the form of, really pushing for an appealing look and feel, because this is how you're putting your stamp on your region when it comes to economic development. So having a document that, takes advantage of good graphics and pictures and charts and things along those lines really goes a long way to kind of talking about your commitment to economic development. And we also, recommend you think about using alternate formats. I mean, in some cases, a Seds can be an 8.5 by 11 document, but in other places, it makes more sense based on the public and based on decision makers and based on what you're trying to achieve to do things a little bit differently and a little more creatively. And, in fact, we've even seen some Seds that have focused on that have been completely online, and Brett will touch on those a little bit later. But the real message here is to kind of embrace the flexibility that's encouraged in the guidelines. And the other kind of main recommendation area that we have in the Seds content guidelines is around the content itself. The first is about linking the different sections that are required within the Seds and make sure that they kind of cascade from one to the other, that they're linked, and that they kind of tell that story to improve the overall Seds focus and measurable impact. The second part of the content side is emphasizing those elements that make the most sense for your particular region. So, probably all the Seds are going to have a number of common themes that you're going to touch on because it is economic development, but there are going to be some things that are very unique to your particular community, your particular region. So whether it's workforce or broadband, energy, housing, the environment, I mean, there's a whole host of issues that come into play here, but you should really think about focusing the Seds based on what works for your particular community or region. The next is this concept of emphasizing measurable goals and strategies instead of just a standalone list of projects. Prior to the release of the Seds content guidelines, one of the things we were struggling with is that the Seds had become these documents that were just laundry lists of projects they were seeking funding for. And while having a active, short, focused project list is important, when you can highlight some key projects in your Seds, that's good. But this laundry list idea we're trying to move away from and really emphasize the strategy behind the Seds. Next was this concept of integrating, leveraging other planning efforts and resources. There are other plans out there, whether other federal plans, state plans, and in a lot of cases, we want to encourage the kind of cross-pollination, which has you thinking about how the Seds would align with other planning activities, and really with the goal of trying to maximize impact. And then finally, from a content perspective, we focus on the Seds content guidelines on how you go about infusing economic resilience into the Seds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Just want to take a quick minute and quickly cover the required sections, the required content, and really what each of these means. So these are the things that you have to have in the Seds per the regulations. The first is this what we call a summary background, which should provide that current economic situation of your region that's supported by the relevant data. And when I say relevant, I'm really talking about those data, those points that really help you tell that particular story. You're going to collect a lot of great information when you're compiling the Seds, but it all doesn't have to be in there. Let's focus on those elements that help you tell the story, and the rest of the things, as I mentioned before, you might want to think about putting in an appendix or something along those lines. So summary background. The next is the SWOTs, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Hopefully you're familiar with that term. And that's really, your opportunity to reflect on and speak to the critical internal and external factors that speak to your region's assets and competitive positioning. And like I mentioned earlier, the Seds is an asset-based plan. So this is about framing your assets and how you want to improve or better leverage them, or in some cases, create new ones, so that businesses want to be established or grow in your particular region. And when you think about the summary background and the SWOT together, that really should kind of lay the groundwork and establish why you're doing a Seds. And it definitely should not be because EDA told you to do it or you're required to do it, but it's really about your vision for your particular region. So it should not only be your vision, but also it should result in basically a general call to action for the stakeholders that you're engaging with as part of the Seds process. The strategic direction and action plan, that's the heart and soul of the plan. These are your measurable goals and objectives, the strategies and the actions, those projects of regional significance that I mentioned earlier that help you determine where you want to go and how you're going to get there. So that's really the meat and potatoes of the Seds. And then finally, the evaluation framework. This should reflect what will be accomplished through the Seds, how you gauge your progress. And it really should be more than just measuring jobs and private investment. We again are encouraging creativity and to think differently about regional and community capacities that can be improved through the Seds. Some will be outputs, some will be outcomes, but they really should speak to regional prosperity in general, however you define it. And if you've used SMART goals, SMART being specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, and time-bound, if you're using SMART goals when you're developing your strategic direction and action plan, you probably already have a good set of performance measures for your evaluation framework, which are critical. And then finally, the other key element that's required is resilience. Again, we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But back to my first point, which is these required sections should work together. They should cascade. They should build off each other. The information that you collect in the SWOT should inform the summary background and the strategic direction, and good goals in the strategic direction should help you figure out how to form your evaluation framework. So again, they should all work together and help you tell that coherent story.
Great, thanks, Dave. So I just want to take a few minutes now to kind of expand a little bit more on some of those changes that Dave mentioned we've seen over the past couple of years with the release of the guidelines. And of course, one of the major, most visible changes we've seen is really the improvement to the look and feel, of the document itself. So on the left side of the screen, you can see kind of the big bad Seds of the past, a giant binder full of text, charts, and statistics, but with little life or personality. This is actually an actual photo from a Seds from the Denver region, I believe, in the early 2000s, which was one of two binders that was submitted to EDA. So you can imagine we're moving in the right direction here. The new Seds that are being created today are visually engaging. They're meant for public consumption. They embrace good design, visuals, infographics, and much more, as you can see on the middle of the screen. And then the next generation of Seds, are really taking things a step further and moving them online, where they can be interactive and multimedia resources with maps, videos, and much more, as you can see on the right side of the screen. Public engagement strategies have also improved and become much more robust and creative. Many regions are moving beyond your traditional public meeting or gathering around a conference table to really bring engagement to the people where they are in the community. So this includes doing outreach and collecting surveys at public events like farmers markets and street fairs, tapping into social media and online tools, organizing bus tours of the region for elected officials and funders to meet with businesses that have received grant funding and loans, and hosting Seds meetings at underutilized or vacant spaces in the community to really provide exposure for property owners to potential businesses or tenants. And yes, of course, in this age of COVID, outreach includes Zoom meetings, which, for all their frustrations, can actually lead to positive and robust engagement when done properly. So what regions measure and tracking has also evolved. Of course, counting jobs and other traditional economic development benchmarks are still important, but places are also thinking about other indicators, such as various forms of wealth or capital that exist in their region. We've at NATO embraced the WealthWorks model of economic development, which is a demand-driven approach that builds value chains. And 8 forms of wealth you can see on the screen. These are individual, intellectual, social, cultural, natural, built, political, and financial. So it's really a powerful model that recognizes that the wealth of a region cannot be measured just in dollars and cents, but in so much more. Your region has strengths in so many of these forms of wealth listed, and really encourage you to leverage these as part of your Seds planning process. So you can learn much more about this approach at wealthworks.org, or feel free to reach out to us at NATO as well. And then finally, as Dave mentioned, we're starting to see more organizations think about better aligning and integrating their Seds with other plans. It's been really exciting to see regions align with transportation plans, hazard mitigation plans, sustainability plans, and much more. So organizations are really breaking down silos both within their staff and the work that they do, and also in the various fields across the region, which is really leading to more efficient, thoughtful, and participatory planning efforts. So with that, Dave's going to talk a little bit more about resilience, which I think is one of the kind of key fundamental updates in the content guidelines, and really kind of at the core of what this work is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. As Brett mentioned, and I spoke to briefly earlier, including economic resilience is the other Seds requirement, along with the summary background and the SWOT and the strategic direction and the evaluation framework. And how we go about integrating resilience into the Seds can take multiple forms. You could think about it in terms of a separate section. We've seen that. You could do a distinct goal or objective or a priority action item. And in some cases, some Seds have it woven throughout the document in different areas. It really doesn't matter how you do it. It's more about making sure that it's there. And one of the places that we often recommend folks to think about resilience, or at least start thinking about resilience, is when you're working on the SWOT, because when you're doing the SWOT analysis, you're all about identifying assets and vulnerabilities, and that's a perfect place to start thinking about resilience. And I should also note too that when we use the term disruption when we're talking about how we define resilience, and that's very intentional. It's more than just natural disasters. We can think about a disruption. It could be a natural disaster. It could be, a flood or a tornado or a hurricane, but it also can be things like the loss of an employer or the downturn in the economy. So we're really encouraging the districts and others that are engaged in developing and updating their Seds to think as broadly as possible about the concept of resilience and how they should approach resilience. Natural disasters and the resilience to natural disasters, it's definitely a good place to start. It can be a gateway, is the way we like to talk about it, if that works for your particular region. But we hope, again, that you'll be thinking about this in the broadest of terms when you think about how to make your particular community or region more resilient. In the guidelines, we recommend approaching economic resilience really from both a long and short-term perspective. Specifically, we think about undertaking, or we suggest you think about undertaking what we call steady state initiatives, which are longer-term efforts that will make the region more likely to withstand any type of disruption, and then also responsive initiatives, and that these are more near-term efforts that are undertaken right after an incident takes place. So some examples of steady state initiatives would be things like diversification efforts, business retention and expansion programs, and those kind of activities that help communities shift their employment base between jobs and industries, retraining programs, things like that. Responsive initiatives include things like pre-disaster recovery planning, establishing communication channels to monitor business needs post-disruption, and employing different processes to connect local officials from different departments to coordinate efforts, after an incident. So in addition to kind of this long and short-term approach, the other thing we recommend is thinking about resilience in terms of, what kind of goals and actions you're going to take that's going to bolster the long-term durability of your region. So, how's this going to fall into your goals and action plans, if that works for you? But also this concept of the district serving as an information network. You guys are really the boots on the ground, and you serve as the repository or this access point of information, and as a convener of stakeholders to gather data and encourage collaboration and the sharing of information. I mean, anytime, any type of a major disruption hits, the first things at EDA that we do is our regional office will reach out to the districts and say, hey, what are you hearing? How are you approaching this? What's the environment with the businesses in that particular area based on what you've seen? So the role that you can play in this convening format and this information gathering format is critical. So we really recommend that the districts think about embracing not just how you're talking about what you're going to do in the Seds, but also how you form this information network.
And you know, when thinking about resilience, you know, we think it's so important to be thinking regionally. You know, whether it's a weather-related disaster, or economic shock, or downturn, you know, these impacts don't give one thought to geographical or jurisdictional boundaries. You know, which makes the need to prepare and respond to shocks a regional effort that goes beyond individual communities or counties. So up on the screen, you see just a few of the many reasons why forming regional partnerships and working at the regional level is so important. These include similar risks and opportunities, the interdependence of economies and infrastructure, and the benefits of an all-hands-on-deck approach really make working regionally and resilience an ideal tactic. And as many of you know, in rural places where resources and support may be limited, a regional approach is almost required to achieve any sort of long-lasting or sustainable outcome. You know, I think it's also important to emphasize regionalism is not another level of government or added bureaucracy or a scheme to make all communities look and act the same. But rather a way to tap into local assets and strengths and leverage those across the region. So of course, as all of you on the call know, working together is easier said than done, but it's really the only way to lead to a more prosperous future. And just to define, you know, regionalism, you know, as it is really a key foundation of most of your work. You know, I've taken this definition from one of my mentors in the field, Steve Etcher. Steve is the former executive director of the Boone Slick Regional Planning Commission in Warrenton, Missouri. As you can see, Steve has said that regionalism is a committed effort to improve communities through increased coordination and collaboration, maximizing efficiency through united approaches while preserving individual aspirations. So I think at the heart of regional cooperation is really striking that delicate balance of united approaches and individual aspirations. And this, of course, is no easy feat, especially in smaller metros and rural communities where there's competition for businesses, for residents, for tourists, and limited funding, where competition can be the norm. But for those of you on the call, you know, that work in regional planning and economic development and healthcare and education, you know that working across jurisdictional lines, breaking down those barriers to collaboration is really critical to meeting your goals.
Yeah, coronavirus. We're still dealing with the ramifications from the pandemic, and you know, we at EDA are still actively engaged in helping communities and regions respond to the impacts of the coronavirus. As many of you know, EDA was provided with $1.5 billion in fiscal year 2020, last fiscal year, to help communities and regions respond to the pandemic. And so far, we've obligated almost $950 million in economic development grants, and our notice of funding opportunity for the remaining funding is still open. A couple things to remember. First, EDA designated EDDs and Indian tribes are eligible applicants. Two, development, update, or refinement of a Seds remains an eligible activity. And any proposed implementation project that's funded under the CARES Act must be consistent with the region's Seds if one exists. So to that last point, you know, communities that are looking to access this funding are going to need the EDDs and they're going to need the Seds. So your importance and the importance of the Seds has never been greater. And speaking of the EDDs, you all are on the front lines of planning and implementing economic development projects that will help your communities respond to and recover from the pandemic. Over 350 of our EDD partners received almost $150 million early on in the process under non-competitive awards, and they've been undertaking some really interesting and innovative projects to help respond to the economic impacts of the pandemic. This includes things like the hiring of numerous recovery coordinators, engaging in various types of recovery planning, development of recovery toolkits, and virtual campaigns and surveys to support impacted businesses, things like broadband data mapping, training and technical assistance to area manufacturers and entrepreneurs, crisis communication plans. I mean, the list goes on. You know, and Brett's going to be covering a specific example, I think, on the next slide. But bottom line, we're really proud of the work our EDD partners have started and will continue to do in the months and years ahead. If you have more specifics, questions regarding the CARES Act and EDA's response to the pandemic, I recommend that you visit the website that you see at the bottom of the slide, or contact your EDA regional point of contact at www.eda.gov/contact.
Great, yeah. So Dave, I just want to kind of now turn to some examples, just two from across the country of how districts have already started putting their CARES Act funding to good use to enhance their Seds and overall resilience planning. So I just want to mention this over in Oregon in the Greater Portland Economic Recovery Plan. So this plan is a joint effort of the Greater Portland Economic Development District and Metro, and was funded through EDA CARES Act funding. This plan includes 3 target impact areas that were identified based on data engagement from economic experts as well as local stakeholders. So these 3 impact areas are helping small businesses grow, advancing economic mobility for individuals, and supporting families and children. So as you can imagine, there's a strong equity and inclusion thread that runs through this entire plan and really serves as a guiding principle for planning and implementation. The plan also has clearly defined action matrix that identifies the target areas, priorities, and action steps, including recommending lead and support organizations to take ownership of meeting these goals. So as this plan notes, the region began working on its Seds about a year ago in February 2020, which gave the team a kind of a preliminary understanding of the region's existing strengths and weaknesses. This foundation then allowed them to move quickly into the development of a recovery plan that will ultimately be integrated into the long-term Sed strategy. So both efforts will continue to inform one another as they're implemented to really address some of those pervasive issues that have weakened the Greater Portland regional economy. So this plan, again, was developed or released just a few months ago, and it's really one of the best economic recovery plans I've seen in response to the pandemic. So I encourage you to take a look and see if it can serve as a model for your work. I also want to mention as an example from Alaska and the Southeast Conference, which is the economic development district that serves a large region around Juneau. You'll be hearing shortly from Meilani, who works with Southeast Conference, so this was a teaser. But briefly, they are utilizing CARES Act funding to develop a standalone resilience plan that will also enhance their Seds as they're working on their 5-year rewrite in 2021. You can see up on the screen some of the goals identified through committees and community surveys that will make up the short-term resilience plan. Given the Alaskan context, many of these goals are likely different than what might be identified in your regions, but I think it's a really good example of conducting complementary resilience planning alongside with Seds developments. It really helps collect timely and useful information, and also helps avoid burnout in your local stakeholders and staff by having too many overlapping meetings and asking too much of your partners. Just last month, Southeast Conference hosted a really phenomenal regional conference, which was virtual, of course, to convene stakeholders from multiple sectors and industries to discuss how best to get through to 22, which I thought was a really great tagline. They used that conference to deliver regional updates and also to conduct surveys online to get information that will support the SWOT analysis and other planning efforts. So you'll get to hear much more from Meilani in just a bit, but really wanted to lift this one up as a great example of this complementary resilience planning that's happening in conjunction with the Seds rewrite. So as Dave and I start wrapping up, just want to share this acronym, which I came up with a few years ago to really capture some of the key attributes of an effective and impactful Seds. Whether you're working on your region Seds or a complementary recovery or resilience plan, I think all of these points are relevant. So just running through them, C is for creative. The content guidelines give you the opportunity to shake things up a bit in your Seds and try some new approaches and platforms and designs. I like to say, your phone or your computer doesn't look like it did 10, 15 years ago, so why should your Seds? E is for engaging. In this fast-paced visual world, look for ways to reach your audience in different ways through visuals, infographics, mobile-friendly designs, and apps. You have a real opportunity here for the Seds to be something that starts a conversation about the future of your region. But if it looks and feels just like another bureaucratic document, you will not get those new groups and individuals involved. D is driven by data. Hopefully, many of you have taken advantage of the host of data tools and resources that are out there, many of them free, to provide critical information about your region. These examples include Stats America, which is funded by EDA, resources from Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and others. So keep it fresh and stay up to date on the most recent data tools. We at the NATO Research Foundation host an ongoing data deep dive webinar series that features many of the free tools that you can use for Seds and other planning purposes. So we'll make sure to share the link to those recordings with you as well. And then finally, Storytellers, S. Use your Seds as a way to tell the story of your region, where it is, where it's been, where it's going, and why this all matters. Tell the story of local residents and businesses that are impacted by this work. At the end of the day, all the work that we do is about people, so let's make sure we don't leave their stories out of the Seds. And speaking of resources that are out there, Dave, you want to chat about Stats America and the Seds Resource Library in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. Brett, you just heard Brett mention, data tools, and one of them is Stats America. And in particular, I wanted to take a minute and just talk a little bit about the Stats America Seds Resource Library. If you're not familiar with Stats America, you should be, except for the Seds Central site, which Brett's going to touch in the next slide. Stats America is probably one of the best resources out there when it comes to making data available to help in the development or update of your Seds. So if you don't know it, you need to get to know it. Specifically though, the Seds Resource Library, which is kind of one widget within the tool set of Stats America, was our attempt to bring the almost 400 Seds developed by our EDD partners into one place, so that EDDs and other regional planning entities could learn from each other, extract best practices, find examples, compare content and style, really about sharing information about the Seds. The inherent flexibility that I mentioned earlier has resulted in some really interesting, really creative Seds that are worthy of taking a look at, particularly for regions that are similar to your own. As of last month, about 65% of all EDDs across the country have uploaded their Seds, so there's already a lot of great examples on the site to take a look at. Specifically, the tool lets you search by name or map. You can either plug in the name of another EDD or you can search on the map. You can explore by category, lets you look for the key sections of other Seds, including resilience, to use as examples. So if you're struggling with your SWOT or with how you should structure your summary background section, you can check that out by looking at other Seds across the country. You can find peers, which lets you look at other Seds that maybe for Seds of other regions that may be facing some of the similar opportunities and challenges that you are, places that have a similar level of population or poverty, for example, and see what they've done, and you may want to take a page from their playbook. And it also provides a little bit in terms of best practices. Basically, those are tips on developing a strong action plan with a lot of useful linkages to the Seds Central site. So please take some time, explore the site as you work with your Seds, and if you haven't uploaded your most recent Seds, please do so. And if you need help with that, please feel free to reach out to your EDA regional office point of contact, or you can reach out to me directly and we can get you hooked up.
Great. Yeah, we've really valued our partnership with the folks over at Stats America, doing tremendous work, and they're so receptive to kind of change and innovation and making sure that the information and data that's part of this website is really applicable to districts and other partners. So if you haven't already, please, not right now, but once we're done here, jump over to Stats America and take a look. And they're always doing webinars and tutorials as well to make sure you're up to date on the latest and greatest. And so, yeah, sedcentral.com, all the links to recordings from webinars and all of our training and materials that we've developed over the past 5 years through this program are developed and posted for free at our website, sedcentral.com. There's webinar recordings, presentation slides, case studies, videos, as well as a Seds 101 section again. For those of you who are new to the process, we update this site almost monthly with new information and resources. So make sure to check back often at sedcentral.com. And so as Dave and I wrap up, economic development, recovery, resilience, it's a marathon. You need to keep yourselves and others engaged along the journey. So really encourage you to celebrate victories as they come along, and don't wait too long to take stock of how far you've come. Southeast Conference in Alaska, I mentioned earlier, won a 2018 NATO Innovation Award for its last iteration of its Seds. You can see staff here celebrating by literally taking their Seds to new heights. And this is my transition, or attempted a transition to turn things over to Meilani Shivens, who you can see proudly hoisting Southeast Conference's last Seds. So Meilani is the owner and director of Raincoast Data and has worked very closely with Southeast Conference for many years on their Seds and other data analysis projects. Really glad she'll be joining us to bring us down to the ground a little bit here and share some thoughts and reflections on what goes into a successful Seds process and document. So Dave, thanks so much for your remarks. We'll see you in a bit for the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to pull up Leilani's slides and he'll take it from here.
Well, thank you so much, Brett and Dave. Even though I'm so familiar with the Seds, I find it so valuable to hear it, again, those pieces, and it's really inspiring. So I have been working on the Seds for 21 years, actually, not the entire time, but I started at working at Southeast Conference in Southeast Alaska 21 years ago. So that type of Seds that Dave and Brett were discussing, that was just a laundry list of projects. That was the first Seds I worked on, and I was literally getting projects from communities saying, you know, we want to purchase a machine to paint crosswalk lines, and now that's transitioned to we want to support the growth of cultural tourism. So just the Seds has become really, really different in terms of its content and in terms of what you know, what you can get out of it. And so I really enjoy the new Seds, as I call it. So what I wanted to do today is just go over a couple tips that I've gotten through the years of working on the Seds for a better, and by better I mean easier for you, Seds to put together. And so this is from my work in Southeast Alaska. So next slide. So tip number one is to think of Seds as just a big jigsaw puzzle. So, you know, it's just your job is to put the pieces together. And the real difficulty at the beginning is that you don't have any of the pieces. Other people have the pieces, their research documents have the pieces. So your job is to go out and collect the pieces, find the people who have them. People may not even know they have the piece. And work through those collaborative opportunities, and the business leaders and community leaders and community residents to figure out what your region needs to grow the economy. And then your job is just to compile those pieces once you've put it together. Next slide. And because of that, tip number two is the longer the process, the better. And so people, you know, they often think about how much time should you set aside for a Seds. Like you can do it quickly. You can do it in 3 months. I see lots of RFPs that come out saying we need someone to help us put our Seds together in 3 months. It's possible, but I would say if you can, plan a year. And the reason that you plan a year is not because you're working on it for an entire year constantly, but because you are doing outreach to so many people and organizations and institutions, and it takes time. And because it is a collaborative experience, the thing you don't want to have happen at the end is somebody say, you know, nice Seds and all, but nobody asked me. I wasn't a part of this planning process. Nobody included me, you know, I would have had something to say. And so just taking that really long period, that long timeline, it really makes the whole process more inclusive, because you'll go through the process, you'll say you're working on the Seds, you'll say it again, you'll say it again. You want people to be kind of sick of hearing it, because that means that you got to everybody and everybody had a chance to be included and provide input. So give yourself that opportunity to take as much time as you need, much longer than you need, in order to make sure that you can reach out to everybody. Next slide. Tip number three is you use committees. So don't try to do the Seds as one thing. You break it into many kind of distinct and discrete pieces. And in Southeast Alaska, so I'm working on the 2025 Seds right now. So I'm in the thick of it, probably like many of you are. And we are running our Seds through 9 different committees. And these are not the same committees that I'm sure that you have in your regions, but you know, figure out what committees you have. And nine is a lot. 9 is probably too many, but if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever number, you can break it into sort of these smaller pieces and run a sort of mini Seds exercise through each of these different committees. so that you can really bring in the high level people and just have them focus on the thing that they're really good at and the thing that they can really speak to. So if you have healthcare professionals, they can just be on the healthcare committee, and you can work through the pieces there, and you know, whatever your different committees are. I just find this to just be an incredibly valuable tool, and going back and looking at that puzzle analogy, it's kind of like, you know, when you're puzzling, you get all the pieces, you know, somebody's working just on the blue sky, so they get all the blue sky pieces and they work on that, and that way you can all, you know, you can work on all these different pieces of the puzzle and then put them together at the end. So I just find this to be really valuable. Next slide. And so this is what my my committees and long 1-year process looks like in terms of committee scheduling. And so what I like to do at the beginning of a Seds process is just to put 3 or 4 committee meetings on a calendar, and your Seds workshop element of these meetings is not the whole meeting. You know, maybe it's 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, maybe it's the whole meeting. Other things are happening at these meetings. But it just gives you a time to calendar out, have a long-term vision, and get as many touch points as you can, and get as many people as involved and as engaged as you can. And so this is current. I think we're gonna have another economic development committee meeting today, but this is almost current to the day. So this is what my planning for the 2025 Seds has looked like. Next slide. So tip number 4 is sticky notes and survey tools. And so this is actually an image of our Seds SWOT process 5 years ago, and it was in a room of 200 people. And I said, you know, we'll just do a sticky notes SWOT analysis. And it seemed like a really good idea, and unfortunately it was too successful because we got, I think, 1,300 sticky notes from everybody. But the real value of that is you're getting the SWOT responses in the voice of the people that you're working with, the business leaders, the community leaders, the political, the government workers. You're getting it in their voice, and they're actually having the opportunity to engage. You could probably, I'm guessing any one of you could sit down and write your own SWOT analysis, but that wouldn't have the same value of engagement and outreach and allowing people to, in their own words, contribute. So the drawback of doing it in person is A, we can't do it in person right now because of COVID, and B, then when you do a sticky note exercise like this, you have to type in every single one of these responses. But it's also very easy to do this type of process online as well. So next slide. So here's an example of just doing the same sticky note exercise, but now we're doing it electronically. So this is a Southeast Alaska energy SWOT analysis strengths. And so rather than having the 3 sticky notes, we just ask people to type them in using a SurveyMonkey tool. I find this to be really valuable. You can make these really short surveys that are, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 minutes long, and just get tremendous amounts of engagement. So here's an example of when we're looking for that language. What is the language of the SWOT analysis? And next slide. And then what I also like to do is, once we have that verbiage in there, you know, then you have this really long list of strengths or weaknesses. And I really like prioritizing them and creating a hierarchy so I can understand what the top strengths are for each of my sectors and for the region as a whole. And so, and again, it's just a 1-minute exercise online, and you can really quickly engage your stakeholders and have them sort of quickly help you categorize these and understand where those highest value strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats are. And again, it's just a great way to increase your level of engagement. Next slide. And so the other way that I use these online survey tools is with the SWOT, but also with the action initiatives themselves. And so this is an example of a survey that we ran through our tourism committee. We developed our 4 tourism initiatives, and then I don't know how the committee wants to prioritize them. I have a guess, and I always think my guess is going to be really, really close to being right, and then it often ends up being wrong. So we give people the chance to then go in and prioritize using these just great online survey tools. So it's just been really, really helpful, makes your life a lot easier. And just a great way to just quickly, you can develop their economic initiatives quickly together and then prioritize them online. Next slide. So going back to what Brett and Dave mentioned about having a svelte Seds. So we went ahead and we create these background documents. So we actually have a really long SWOT analysis document online on our website, but we'll probably take one page and it'll probably look like, so on the left-hand side, you see the front page of our SWOT analysis document, and on the right page, you see our one-page summary of that document. I think the document is like 45 pages, but we'll have a one-page summary with those strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats, the very just top line responses from each of those. So you can quickly look at this one page and understand so much about our region, what our region is going through, and what are the main elements and the main strengths and weaknesses are, just in a single page. And so we can push all of that much longer research document, we can push that to an attachment, we can push it online, people can read it whenever they want if they want to take that deeper dive, but we'll just have that one-page summary that gets pushed to the Seds itself. Next slide. So one thing that we do that I think is pretty unique is, and this is my tip number 5, is the summary background. We do it a little bit differently. It is required to be done every 5 years. So when you're doing your 5-year Seds, to create that summary background that Brett, I think, really did a good job of describing earlier. We do it every year, and we've just found that this is one of the most useful pieces of our Seds, is to have that relevant, up-to-date, really meaningful economic data put together on an annual basis. And so we create this short economic summary background document that we push out every year. It's graphic, it's visual, like Brett was describing, and this way, we print several thousands of these. We have it online. We get many downloads. I don't even know how many. This is used by our business leaders, our community leaders. It's used by our political leaders as they're making political decisions. And there's just nothing like being able to put out that economic information on an annual basis. It's just really widely used. Next slide. And so here are some just internal pages from that Southeast Alaska by the numbers, as we call it, our summary document. So we've got just a data table with the top economic indicators, an overview of the economy as a whole, and then a deeper dive into our key economic sectors and how they're doing on an annual basis. And I think there was a link at the bottom, but everything's on the Southeast Conference homepage, so it's seconference.org if you want to look at that yourself. Next page. And before I get to tip number 6 and 7, I should have probably had a tip in there about economic resiliency. We actually today, as soon as I finish this meeting, I will go and we are releasing our economic resiliency mapping report. And so that's something that you can look at as well, that's going out today. It should be interesting. It'll be on that page, that website I just gave you. So tip number 6 is find a better name. So I know Brett and Dave like the name Seds, but nobody else likes the name Seds. It doesn't mean anything to most people that you're going to be working with and presenting this to. And then when you say, oh, well, Seds means a comprehensive economic development strategy, that doesn't necessarily help. And so, find a name that's relevant to your organization and your region. We called our last plan 5 years ago the Southeast Alaska Economic Plan 2020. I liked that because it was just descriptive. it let people know exactly what it was. It doesn't need to be that, it can be anything, but find a name that speaks to the people in your region. Just because Seds kind of, it gets a little too, puts people off because they don't necessarily know what it is. And so they don't necessarily see themselves as somebody who needs to be involved in it, because the name, it kind of can be a little, off-putting. So find a name that's great for you. And tip number 7, and I think Brett and Dave both talked about this, keep the document short. So here's a copy of what our Seds looked like. Our current Seds, I'm developing one this month. We'll have a new one, but keep it short, keep it relevant, keep it something that people can just have on their desk, in their bag, that people can look at all the time. By keeping it short, it keeps it accessible. And so it's just really easy to make one-page summaries and push all of those other documents into appendices that can be downloaded as many times people like, but isn't part of the document itself. Next page. So here's an example of a one-page summary, and make sure, no matter how long or short your Seds is, make sure that you can have just a one-page summary of the entire document, because for some people, that's all they're going to look at, is that one-page summary. And so here's our 43 economic initiatives and priority objectives in a single page. And then if you want to kind of even go more high level than that, next slide. Here's our 7 priority objectives that Southeast Conference focused on during the last 5 years, so that you can just really have these really short graphics or really short one-pagers that people who are not going to do a deep dive into economic planning, so you can really easily bring them into the process and show them that those top line level information and what the plan is about and what you're working on. And I think that's really critical to engaging people in the larger process. Next slide. And that is it. So I probably could have come up with tips all day. I didn't want to duplicate too much of what Brett and Dave were talking about, but I am happy to answer any questions like you. I'm deep in developing a Seds right now. Here's my contact information if you want to reach out. And of course, I'm available now for any questions that you might have. So with that, Brett, I am going to turn it back to you.
All right, Mailani, thank you so much for that presentation. As always, you bring such tremendous insight and perspective to this process. If it didn't come across earlier, a huge fan of your previous iteration, and just can't wait to see what's in store for this next version of the Seds. So thanks so much for that. So with that, I'll ask.
Hey, Brett.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think that she should add one more tip, which is tip number 8, which is keep it sexy, because it's sexy. And I've said that before, and people have laughed, but I think the Southeast Conference Seds in particular, has shown that it can really be an interesting, engaging document. I hopefully folks picked up on that when they looked at your presentation and they saw those great graphics and photos and the way you arrange things. But I think there's a lot to be said for that. So that would be my one suggestion, is having that 8th tip, keep it sexy.
I have often called my Seds sexy, but I just didn't know that anybody else did. I thought I was, I think it is fun, it's engaging, it's sexy, it's exciting, and that's what I'm going for, to get people to make economic planning fun and exciting, and I think it can be and it should be. And the Seds is the nice thing about the 2015 guidelines that you discussed, really gives it the opportunity to do that. Oh, we're putting our cameras on now. Okay, let me do that too. Hello. So yeah, it is. I enjoy the process. It's a long process, like I said, but getting everyone engaged and then making something that's relevant and everyone can easily use and they're excited to use is really fun and really rewarding.
Excellent, great. Well, we had a few questions come through and encourage folks to add their own in the questions box. We've kind of built some extra time in today, about 10-15 minutes to get to those questions. But yeah, I mean, there's one that just popped up here. It says, as an assistant for a small economic development district, what is a good way to advocate for taking time to create a visually appealing Seds document? I know, Melanie, it can be intimidating, especially for organizations that might not have the graphic design expertise or resources to hire an outside design firm or consultant. Kind of what are your thoughts or kind of maybe some best practices for doing as much as you can, maybe with a few resources on the visual front?
Yeah, I mean, part of it's, when I have my phone, I'm constantly taking photos. And it's, it's hard to find good photos after the fact, but when I'm going to different communities, when I'm going to different events, when I'm like on project sites, even if I just see a construction project in my neighborhood, I'm taking pictures because and I have so many boring pictures on my phone. Not boring, but they're not personal. Like I'm like, well, maybe I'll be able to use this picture of a cruise ship sometime later. It's a beautiful day, so I'll just take a picture. And so just kind of living 24/7 with the Seds in your head that you may, and just using your iPhone, and maybe you'll have a chance to use those photos at a later time.
Yeah.
And people like to see themselves in the Seds. They like to see their communities and their projects, and so when you do have a chance in person, just constantly take photos.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, avoid stock photos at all costs. I mean, really make this your own. I couldn't agree more, Melanie, your idea of kind of give it a name, something that reflects the local community's values and goals. There's a district in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that actually has a local artist that designs the cover of their Seds each time, and it's really unique and has lots of specific areas and landmarks that are really special to that region. So just something like that that really kind of personalizes it, and again moves away from that big bad binder to something that folks would maybe pick up and read, in a dentist's office, in a waiting room, that sort of thing that kind of spark their interest if that's possible. Great, I see some more questions coming through. There was one that did ask, Dave, you talked earlier about kind of the elimination of the project list and trying to move away from that laundry list. The question you're asking about, is there still a role, how do you still identify projects? Folks, elected officials, other stakeholders still do want to see, some of these projects identified. Kind of what are your thoughts? And Melanie, I'd love to hear too, the best way to kind of strike that balance between not just this, laundry list, but something that's really targeted and, could be funded.
Yeah, and I think that's why I refer to it as kind of an action plan rather than a project list, because an action plan really speaks to the fact that you're gonna, these are gonna be a specific set of projects, a smaller set that you're gonna want to actually take action on, and you're gonna put some thought behind, who's engaged and the dollar amounts and things like that. So I think the key is to put more thought and energy into, a fewer number of projects, but those that you really are going to do something with, rather than just, again, that really lengthy list of, everything in the kitchen sink that you hope to achieve. So I think you're right. I think there is that middle ground, which is the best place to be.
Well, and also I think any project that a community or organization has, it should be able to fit into one of your initiatives. So, like Dave was talking about earlier, that the initiatives they're more broad based. It's not a machine that paints sidewalks. Or crosswalks. It's community and public safety. And so it's broadening. It's bringing those initiatives up to a higher level. And if you've got, public safety in there somehow, I'm just taking this one project, but you can say, okay, well, I'm looking at the plan and it has this element in there, and my project would work under this initiative. And so it's just what we're doing is, instead of having that specific project, you take it up to sort of the category, the higher level, and then all of your projects are going to fit into the Seds. They should fit into the Seds. I mean, and I think that's a good, you should figure out what those projects are and do that, make sure that they fit, make sure that there's a category under which they fit. And, we do that all the time. It's like, somebody wants to build a tribal house. Well, we don't have a Seds initiative for that. So let's create a community wellness initiative, a cultural and community wellness initiative, and then that tribal house like fits under that, and then it's part of the Seds. So it's sort of a reclassification. You're just taking it up to that slightly higher level rather than the specific project as project category.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to the original message of, this isn't, you're not chasing kind of one-off projects, chasing the money. It, needs to be tied to some sort of vision. And that's really what the Seds is. It's a process, it's the values, it's the goals of the community. And so all of those should be able to fit into those categories exactly. So two quick questions for Dave here we can probably knock out. One question, how much funding does EDA provide districts each year to support the Seds process? And then another question, do you anticipate any changes to the content guidelines under the Biden administration?
Great questions. To the first point, most districts receive around $70K a year. In some cases, it's going to be a little bit different. We've been working very hard over the last number of years to make sure that all the districts are on par in terms of funding amounts. There are some that are still going to be a little bit higher, but for the most part, we've tried to make it as equal as possible, and it's around $70K. The second question was, do you expect any updates to the Seds content guidelines? Yeah, there probably will be. The great news about the Seds content guidelines, however, is that when we first did them back in 2015, we talked about them and emphasized so many different elements that a lot's already in there, but there's always room for more. And in places where we've even touched on certain things, I think one of them I can think of right off the top is equitable development. I mean, we have a paragraph in there that talks about the importance of equitable development, but I know equity in underserved communities is a major push for the current administration. So I can only imagine that we're going to be doing some things that are going to probably expand not only what we say in the Seds content guidelines about equity and equitable development, but also pointing to different tools and resources. So the short answer is yes, there probably will be a couple of things that we'll want to update based on the priorities of this particular administration. And I should point out too that, that's the Seds often becomes the first thing that a new administration will kind of latch onto when they're talking about something new. They'll come in and say, oh, I'm interested in climate resilience and I'm manufacturing and equity and they'll have a list of things they'll want to do, and they'll be like, well, what's the best way to go about doing that? It always comes down to the Seds. It's back to the first point that I made, which is, if you want to do good economic development, you start with good economic development planning. So if you want to focus communities on particular priorities, you start by having them focused on those things in their plan. So I can only imagine that there will be a number of webinars that we'll do with NATO over the next couple of years focused on all of these different priorities, because we've added all of these in some way or form to the Seds content guidelines. Great,
thanks, Dave. A few questions coming in from Melanie. I'll lump them together. One asking about this individual is actually working on doing a survey at the moment, an online survey. Any kind of tips for getting more engaged public? How do you get the word out? How do you get those responses that you're looking for? And then another question here about this idea of kind of, do you anticipate kind of some of the lessons you've learned this past year having to be virtual and remote with your public engagement, with your committees? Do you see kind of any lessons learned that will kind of carry on into the future? I mean, do you see kind of a hybrid approach to your engagement? Is there expectations now that everything will be, streamed online? Just, what's the best that we could take from this time that might apply in the future for getting more robust engagement?
Well, the part two is pretty easy for me, because Southeast Alaska is 32 communities that are not attached by road. We're already very remote, and so we were Zooming. I discovered Zoom and introduced it to Southeast Conference years before the pandemic. So that's how we were already engaging. It's always so. But I think what we've realized is how much even though it's easy to do the online engagement, we miss that social connectivity. And it's, you have that sort of social capital that you build up, and you can still build it up a little bit using Zoom, but just being able to have those in-person connections, it's, the further you get away from it, the more you realize you miss it. But I think Zoom is fantastic. Just a great way to share presentations and to have discussions, and I don't have to fly to wherever this meeting is taking place today to participate. And there's so many wonderful things about expanding that level of networking and connectivity using these online and virtual tools. But you can't replace that personal time. So I think it just showed us how valuable it is. We don't necessarily need it to be effective, but gosh, just those side conversations and those personal conversations, that's it's more like we just need a little bit of that to bring it back in, and then it makes the Zoom and the remote all that more effective. I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's worked really well for Southeast Conference and for Seds development. It's been a good platform to do it on. Of course, it's a tough year to do economic planning. I say at the beginning of every single one of my meetings, I was like, this is the hardest time to do economic planning, but there's never been a more important time. So it's a tough case to do it under, but really valuable. As for surveys, gosh, I've done 60 surveys in the last 5 years, I think. So I have so many survey recommendations. I really like SurveyMonkey as a tool, and I found it to be really effective to actually get the email list of people's names and to use the SurveyMonkey tool to send it out via SurveyMonkey to people individually. You get a much higher response rate if you're sending it out that way. Also, I'll do surveys during meetings. So I'll get the Zoom meeting going. We'll have the 40, 50 people at a meeting, and then I'll just put a link in the chat box to the survey so people can fill it out then and just click on it and link on it. Getting people to open their, to like go to a Facebook page and link on it, that's becoming less and less effective. That was much more effective several years ago. So just continually figuring out how to get that link, people to open that link, I think is really valuable. But right now, the direct send to the email and the link in the Zoom chat box or the online chat box is really, really valuable these days, and it's been really effective for me.
Great. Thanks for that. We might do a special survey webinar, so keep an eye out for that. Maybe if you'd love to pick your brain on that.
Yeah.
There's a question that came in about kind of staffing around this. I know, Melanie, you're kind of in a unique situation with your partnership with Southeast Conference, but the question is asking, do you recommend a dedicated Seds staff member? And Dave, love to hear kind of your perspective as well from EDA. I can chime in too. Just kind of the staffing needs to make this a reality and a really valuable process. So Melanie, any kind of initial thoughts about staffing to get this done?
So I'm a contract employee. So I do a lot of work that's not Southeast Conference and Seds related for clients all over Alaska. And I think it's a great model. I mean, Southeast Conference, they're not paying for my health insurance. They're just paying for my hours. So, and I think that there's more people like me who are contractors, but have the skill level to come in and maybe somebody who's worked with the organization before or knows the organization who can kind of come in and just, every hour is billable. There's no wasted time when people have me there, and I can just focus on getting the Seds done and done right. And so being able to tap into those types of resources, I think is valuable. It's not hiring a consultant to do the Seds. I think it should be done internally. And what somebody like me does is just increase the level of staff support. I just kind of grow the staff of an organization for the time that they need me, and when I'm not, I'm growing the staff level of some other organization. And I think that's a fantastic model. I don't know how you find people like that in each community, but I think that there are a lot of people like me out there. So that would be my input.
Yeah, it's certainly, it varies across the country. As we know, economic development districts have various levels of staffing and resources and sizes of geography that they're engaging. So it's really kind of leveraging all those staff. It's been encouraging to see, again, these disaster recovery coordinators being hired on, many of them through CARES Act funding that can help leverage some of that Seds work, that focus on the resilience and that coordination. But it's really unique to each district. But I think at the end of the day, you said you want someone that knows the community, has that trust, knows the issues, and can really, kind of build that, collaboration to make sure that the document reflects the region. So yeah, we're pushing up to quarter after here. I want to give both of you a chance for any kind of final remarks and reflections before we say farewell. But again, really appreciate both of you coming along. So Dave, I don't know if final words of wisdom on our way out.
No, I just think the one message I wanted to get across, and hopefully everybody heard that, is to embrace the flexibility that's inherent in the Seds content guidelines, and do what works best for you and for your community and for what you're trying to achieve. I mean, I love Melania's point about changing the name of the document because it worked best for her community and her region. We're fully supportive of those kind of moves. So definitely take advantage of that in every step along the process, if it again, depending on what works best for you. So yeah, that's my message.
Great.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, the Seds it's really about community and collaboration and working together, and Brett gives me lots of credit for putting the Seds together, but all I'm doing is really being a scribe for the business leaders and community members, and just really tapping into that sort of collective wisdom and capturing it in a way that it can be reflected back. And so that's all we're doing, and it's exciting. I mean, it's really valuable. What you're doing is really valuable and really important for your community, for your region, and on the for the EDA and the federal government to look at what each region is doing on that national level. And so just know what you're doing is important and it's exciting, and go out and get them.
Great. Well, it's a great way to wrap things up here. And I just want to thank both of you for a really interesting, enlightening, and fun conversation. Always great seeing both of you. And to all of you who joined us today for the call, hope that this met your expectations. I know there were a few questions we weren't able to get to, but please feel free to follow up with myself, and I can either respond or pass those along. Just know that there is a whole national network out there that is doing this work, and I think it's really so important for us to kind of keep that in mind. It's easy every day to kind of just kind of see what's right in front of us, but take heart that there are hundreds of organizations and staff around the country working on these with similar goals of stronger, resilient, and equitable regions. So thanks so much for all the work that you do. As you close out, there'll be a short survey. Speaking of surveys, that'll pop up on the screen. Give us a little bit of feedback on what we're doing here, and to again ask any other questions that we can respond to. But again, hope to see many of you, if not all, March 23rd for our next webinar on rural economic development. Should be a great conversation with Don Mackey. So until then, take care of yourselves and keep up all the work that you're doing for your regions, and we'll see you soon. So thanks again so much. Take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.